possibilities that we can create through stories.
For an independent filmmaker to get into Sundance is a huge thrust. The odds are incredibly long.
It can mean the world of difference in how your film is seen and how far its reach is.
Sundance is always changing, using everything that Adobe has and everything that we have. In some ways, they keep us fresher because they're on the edge of technology. So it's a partnership.
Because all the Adobe programs know each other and speak to each other, it makes my work faster.
Premiere, it's just a little more intuitive. There is something that just feels like it was built for the user.
So with Premiere, I can just pop into After Effects anytime. We try to do a lot of it all at once. The kind of division of labor that exists in other programs kind of drives me crazy.
I choose Premiere Pro because of the ease of the interface. There's a real lack of rigidity in the software. It just becomes an extension of my hands.
I can't tell you exactly why I like Premiere. And it's like an intangible thing. It just makes sense with my brain.
If you're really experienced, it's not going to hold you back. I can only expect that it's going to become the most dominant NLE out there.
Using all the Adobe tools, low budget doesn't look low budget any longer. It always gets back to the story.
People can make images all day long, and so what's going to make you stand out? It has to be your heart, your unique experience, the color of your soul.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Megan Keene, and I'm from Adobe. And as the video said, at Adobe, we truly believe that everyone has a story to tell, and that's really the inspiration behind Creativity for All. So I'm really excited that you're all here, and we're also live streaming the panel, so welcome to the live stream audience, for this panel, Empowering Every Voice in Film and the World. I'm so excited about this panel because we really truly have such a wonderful diversity of perspective and experience here on this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, we have Yance Ford, who is featured in the documentary Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen, that is premiering here at the festival this year. He is also the director of Strong Island, which was Oscar nominated and premiered at Sundance in 2017. So with that, we're gonna watch a short clip from Strong Island.
What they spent time on was investigating his background. That's what they spent time on.
Day by day, you hear that your son is being investigated. Day by day, you hear rumors. And you grow more and more afraid. Having grown up in the South, where the cops and the Klan were one and the same, my parents didn't turn to the police for protection. They had already felt that the police had turned their own son into the prime suspect in his own murder. So not only is the phone ringing, not only is there a car across the street, but there is the growing sense that the DA is going to actually let this kid get away with murder.
Yeah. Next, we have Eileen Meyer, who is the editor of Crip, which is premiering here at the festival. It opened the festival last night. I had the absolute pleasure of seeing the film. It's phenomenal. And in preparing for this panel, Eileen mentioned that editing Crip Camp was truly a life-changing experience, a once-in-a-lifetime, and really changed the way that she looked at the world. So with that, let's take a very quick look at a clip from Crip Camp.
I mean, when Woodstock was happening, I remember being at my grandmother's listening on the transistor radio and saying, wish I could go, wish I could go, wish I could go. And then When I went to Jeanette, it was like, there I was in Woodstock. The music and the people. I just feel like these people are crazy, you know? I mean, in a good way.
Have to catch Jeanette and find yourself, you know? Freedom, freedom, freedom,
So something that it was a utopia when we were there. There was no outside world. Way from my home, yeah.
And next we have Stacy Goldate, who is the editor of Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen, which is also premiering at the festival this year. Stacy was also the editor of a film called Hillbilly in 2018, which looked at media representation of people living in rural Appalachia. So we are going to take a look at a clip of Disclosure.
Hit it, maestro. All of me. Why not take all of me? Can't you see I'm no good without you?
What's interesting for me about growing up in Mobile, Alabama, and then having my first interactions with what it meant to be transgender happening on television is that even when characters weren't necessarily trans-identified, I think those characters affected how I thought of myself as a trans person and how the general public probably thinks about trans people. And one of those early images for me was the character of Geraldine from the Flip Wilson show. I remember I would watch it with my mom and my brother, and my mother loved Geraldine and would laugh at that character, so it's something that existed in the realm of humor. But whenever there was something trans this or sex change that.
A sex change operation. A sex change operation.
Right.
I better sit down.
I would be very interested, and I would sort of lean in, but very sort of discreetly. I think one of the first trans representations I saw in a fictional context was that episode of The Jeffersons with Edie Stokes.
It's me, Eddie. Only I'm Edie now.
Say what?
Take a good look.
She was beautiful and elegant and Black. But then also there was the character that George hired to say that he was Edie, to sort of let Weezy know that he wasn't cheating. That representation felt like it existed as a joke, and the same bullying that I was experiencing at school.
What's that?
I was like, this is not who I am. You know, I went to church every Sunday and was a straight-A student, and I won talent shows with the tap and jazz dance numbers I choreographed myself. Did. So that was like who I was, and my mom wanted me to be successful, and I was being groomed to be successful, and then I turn on the television and I see these images that don't seem to comport with like the person that I knew I was. And so everything that was trans about me, it made me just hate.
And finally, we have Crystal Kayiza. Crystal is the director of a short film, See You Next Time, which is in the festival this year. But Crystal really plays all roles. She is editor, director, producer across many films that she has created, including Edgecombe, which was a short film that played in the festival last year. Crystal was also part of the Sundance Ignite program in 2018. So she's no stranger to Sundance. So we're gonna look at a clip from Edgecombe, which explores racial injustice in rural areas of North Carolina.
I was going uptown to mail a letter one day. I saw all them children from the high school going toward Main Street. The kids had broke away from the school. Said they're gonna march this morning. Every police officer in Edgecombe County is on that corner down there. They gonna crack some heads. They told you better get out of the way. Walk over you. I stood there. About that time I heard somebody say, "Ain't that Mr. Wee? You ain't gonna walk over Mr. Wee." These were the kids I had for years through the Sunday school. They go back to the school and send a committee back down there. And get a permit. They'll let her march. Yes, I was in a day, but the Jim Crows. You had to wait till the next movie started. Down the bottom, there were many seats. We couldn't use them. Water fountain right there. But you couldn't drink out of it. Restroom right there. Paid the same price for a meal, but you had to go around the back. Knock on the window. So it was hard. But we learned a lot from it. There's a God somewhere. There's a God somewhere. He's to get I've been there. Go over town. Ask somebody about Deacon Johnner, Wee Johnner, Mr. Johnner. Got so many names. Mr. Wee.
So welcome to all of our panelists. I love what a rich and interesting background is represented here, both through your personal experiences as well as the films that you have worked on and helped create. I'd love to hear how you feel your personal experience has helped you to develop your creative voice and the perspective with which you approach storytelling. And we'll start with you, Yance.
Well, first of all, I'm just blown away by all your work. Thank you so much for doing that and sharing these incredible clips. It's just such a privilege to be up here with all of you.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. I mean, for me, yeah, exactly. I think that my background is, as a child of, parents who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in the Jim Crow South, moved to the suburbs of New York and had their American dream destroyed. And I think that part of living that experience, it really kind of made me very and sometimes I think that it's a little intense for people, but I have a very, there's something about injustice that gets under my skin. And that when I see it, I'm really motivated to document it, to bring it to light. And I also think that the people who find themselves in situations that are beyond their control, but that are unjust, when they fight those battles against injustice, I'm really inspired by those people. And so for me, my filmmaking practice is really about trying to just allow for people's humanity to come through, to keep things very simple, to connect with my subjects in a way that helps them feel safe and therefore to be more revealing and trusting of the audience that will eventually be on the other side of the camera.
And how about you, Eileen?
So I think one of the things that really shaped the way that I approach my editing and filmmaking was my schooling, which was very outside of the norm, you would say. I went to a Quaker school, which was basically like a hippie school, kind of like Janned, to be honest, where you could just kind of run wild and like do whatever you wanted and create your own classes and do projects. And I think it really taught me how to think outside of the box and to make my own rules. And I think that's had a really big impact on my life and also on my work.
And you, Stacy?
Yeah, I think that I've kind of had a life where I've lived a lot in sort of the in-between spaces. Like I was born in Philadelphia, and then we moved to Memphis, Tennessee. And, and so in Philadelphia, I was with my mom. My mom's family had been there, and it was my Jewish family. And, I had bat mitzvah. And then I moved to Memphis was with my dad and his Catholic family. And so had this interesting experience of going from north to south and then being, feeling like, isn't everybody Jewish? To having to tell people, don't worry, I'm probably not going to hell. It's okay. You don't have to worry about me. And then as I got older and started to understand myself more, I discovered that I was pansexual, bisexual, and, really sort of, not really feeling like I was part of a binary in terms of my sexual orientation. And then I think just in a lot of ways, just politically, I've been very influenced by having a family that is very driven by, like, we have to do something. We just have to do something. That's not right, And so I think that a lot of the things that have driven me is like, okay, so how can what's my tool? Like, what's my medium, And I think for me, it was editing where I felt like I could kind of be in a room, not a dark room because I like having windows, but be in a room and just sort of like immerse myself in other people's stories. And so.
Great. And you, Crystal?
Yeah, I had kind of similar experience in terms of trying to figure out how to navigate my identity in space. I grew up in Oklahoma, and my family is Ugandan. I'm first generation, so that clearly was a very interesting experience. And I just like consumed media as a means to navigate like what is Americanness, what is citizenship, what is what does it mean to be a young person in the suburbs? And I was really fortunate to be a part of a nonfiction film program in high school, and it like became a huge escape for me. And that was like the first time that I really articulated my voice and felt like I had a really amazing, mentor who was affirming that. And that wasn't an experience I had before. Coming as myself, it was always kind of, trying to navigate and figure out what spaces I fit in between, or kind of like figuring out, negotiating myself at home versus myself in kind of the broader community. But I think the nonfiction space in particular, but like film as a medium broadly, was the first tool that I had to really articulate what I was seeing around me and kind of speaking in a way.
It sounds like across the board, all of you have sort of looked to storytelling as a means to dissect identity and explore identity. And Yance, you've previously spoken about creative magic, which is this time when a creative or a storyteller feels empowered to really speak from their authentic truth. And what do you think is the importance of authenticity with creativity? Like, can one exist without the other? And what are the importance of those two things together?
Sure. For me, authenticity and sort of being your authentic self in the world, it comes first, and then being your authentic self in your work, because it's like even if I'm not in the frame, I'm there, right? Even if I'm not in the film, I'm there, and so my choices are driven by what I value. My decision about what to look at and for how long, is driven by the fact that I like to look at things until I understand them, and that's who I am as a person, right? Having grown up also in the suburbs and with like a not interesting visual environment, for me, looking and embracing the fact that I am someone who can sort of just observe the world go by for a day, for an hour, and from that experience of observation come away with so much information. But also, I think for me, the experience of being looked at and not conforming to my gender from a very early age, and then also sort of being, making the necessary but uncomfortable choice to be in front of the camera in my own film. All of those decisions are based on this sort of knowledge of how important it is to see oneself, but also to see other people, but from a place of, I think, compassion and empathy and understanding and sort of shared humanity. And I think you can't actually get to any of that without a sense of knowing and valuing who you are.
Crystal, what do you think happens when storytellers, creatives are empowered to really tap into their authentic selves?
Yeah, I think that a lot of kind of diving into projects for me is like I get really consumed with intention, and I think being in and having time and being empowered and having the resources to really focus on, for me in nonfiction, the most tenuous but like important space for me as a filmmaker is where my creative vision and the reality of the space meet. My relationship with the people on camera meet in a way that's authentic and honest and truthful. And there's ways to navigate that alone, but like having a support system and a structure and a community to work with that is encouraging that honest interpretation of vision, I think is really important. And the labor of taking that on, which, in my, personally speaking, I find the most difficult but rewarding part of filmmaking, having the support makes that process, I think, maybe not necessarily easier, but you really, I think, are more of an honest storyteller in that way.
It's interesting that you bring up support, because for Eileen and Stacy, you're editors. So as an editor, you are, by definition, helping someone else tell their story. How do you continue to be tapping into your own creative vision while sort of helping bring to life the story of someone else?
So in the case of Crip Camp, we were working with this incredible black and white video footage that was shot at the summer camp in the early 70s. And there's something about that material just in the raw that is just, it is so authentic. And it's a story that then gets to be told from the inside out. Like one person in our feedback screenings described it as being dropped into a world or a universe where you don't speak the language, and by the end of the film, you're fluent. And I feel like that the reason that footage is that way is because it was shot by this group of people, the People's Video Theater, that were like really into like community video and activism. And like one of their mission statements was to not tell other people's stories, to empower people to tell their own stories. And you can see it in the footage. Like, they show up at this camp having no idea what they're getting into, and they just teach the kids how to use the equipment and hand it over and put microphones in their hands, and like the kids are telling their own story. And so I think for me, like as an editor, for me and Mary Lamson, who I worked with on the project, and Andrew Gersh, like, you know, I think we could all see that that footage just basically can live on its own, because finding the authentic moments is our job. And so we took a very hands-off approach, I would say, on that material, and just let it live like the way that it was. And it lets you just sink into the world in this like immersive way where you become friends with the characters and
care deeply.
Yes. And go along with their like coming of age story, because we can all relate to that.
And how about for you?
Definitely looking at the footage. It was so great on Disclosure. So when I first met with Sam Fader, the director, and Amy Shoulder, producer, about working on Disclosure, we talked about how important it was that this wasn't just going to be a documentary. This wasn't going to be of a like a film history or survey. This was actually the personal history and the personal stories of how the television and the films that all of us have consumed throughout our lives, how they impact how we feel about ourselves and how you see yourself. And so everybody who is interviewed in Disclosure is transgender, gender nonconforming, and it's telling the stories of like the shows that they watched and how they were feeling, as you saw in the clip. And I think for me, you're having a relationship when you're watching footage. Like you feel a relationship with the people who are speaking, with the interviewees. You're having like this. It's like a conversation. They're speaking, but you're still feeling, and you're taking it in, and you're interpreting it. And so as an editor, I feel like a bridge. I'm like a bridge between like the vision of like Sam and the conversations I've had with Sam and Amy and like the audience. And I think it's important for me, as someone who's not trans, to understand sort of the vision, but also think of myself as someone who might be in the audience and try to make that connection. So I think it's really important when you talk about authenticity to really think about who you are, so you can understand, like, I'm not going to project myself onto this footage. I'm going to let the raw and the footage speak for itself. So I think it's important to always be aware of yourself while you're working with this material.
So across the film festival this year, Sundance has said that it really represents the most diverse perspectives ever in the film festival. And it's wonderful to be seeing all of these diverse perspectives in the festival and in the films. But I was struck last night in the Q&A after Crip Camp that Judy Heumann said, the ultimate question is, what's next? So, okay, so these stories are being told, but like, where do we go from here, and how do we continue to expand the stories and empower more voices? And so my question to you is, what's next? How do we continue to empower more voices? What can people be doing to help encourage people who maybe never thought that their voice or their story was important or could be told? What do we do about it?
Well, one thing that someone said last night was just that there needs to be more stories of the disability community. And hopefully, like, once this film gets out there, I mean, it's really like the first film of its kind that's reaching that community, or is going to have that big of a audience from that
reaching
community.
A community outside of that, like exactly, really expanding the story to people who've never really understood that it's important how wide a doorway is.
Right. Yeah, and like, you know, and hopefully that helps, you know, when we talk about the word diversity, people will also think about disability being included in that, because I feel like that's the last thing that people think when they hear that word.
Yance, in prepping for this panel, you said something that really struck me, which was, for every day you wake up, for every breath you take, there's an opportunity to learn. If you are willing to learn, you will fall into a category of ally faster. So how important is allyship in all of this?
Sure. I think it's key. I think that if we are ever going to get to a place where, you know, film, television, you know, all of the content that we create is an equitable environment, one that is reflective of our society as a whole. I think if you have power, you have to learn how to share it. You have to learn the value of sharing power. You also have to learn what sharing power looks like. I think that the whole notion of creating space and allowing people to come into that space needs to be reframed. I think that we have to start, you know, allies have to start understanding that they don't own spaces, that they might have the, you know, the means to get to those spaces first and in larger numbers, but then part of being an ally is then turning around and making it possible for the space to be a shared one, to be a community space, to, you know, to broaden the pod to, you know, as wide a circle as possible. And I also think that, you know, teaching yourself and accepting that, you know, if you are an ally and you think that that representation is important and the diversity of viewpoints and perspectives and lived experience is important, then educate yourself on what that actually means, what those experiences are. Accept that you have that responsibility. Embrace it as something that's a gift and a privilege, not necessarily as something that you need to, you know, use as a cudgel to beat yourself up with, because nobody is interested in anyone feeling guilty or, you know, sad, because that's not useful for anyone. But what is useful is figuring out how you can activate what resources and access and privilege you have, you know, to make it possible for other filmmakers who are outside of these spaces to come in and either get training or access to resources or funding or equipment. There's, you know, an endless number of possibilities. There are as many possibilities, you know, for shared space and for allyship as there are people in this room, as there are people watching on the live feed. I think it's just people have to remember that they are creative, right? And they can think outside their box and help make change in their way. And everybody doing their part will then shift tectonically faster the society that we're all trying to move into a better place.
You bring up the topic of accessibility, and I think that that's a really big one too. I think in the digital age, it can be argued that never before has it been as easy to access storytelling and filmmaking. Crystal, how has technology helped in your creative journey?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, you know, having access to the tools to be able to make your work, like, literally makes or breaks the work getting done. And I think that, you know, when we talk about access and opening up space, and like, Yance, what you were saying before in terms of creating space, part of that has to do with resources. And, you know, I'm really fortunate to have been able to go to film school and to build community and make the connections with people that have the resources to, like the film that I have at Sundance this year, like Leroy, who's probably somewhere in here, like, is a really phenomenal DP and like gave his time and camera. And I like wouldn't have had that connection if I didn't get a scholarship to go to film school. Like, but, you know, I think we don't necessarily think about all the decisions that have to happen to get someone in that room to have the conversation with the DP that 5 years later shoots their film for free. So I think that's a really big conversation. And just to add in terms of the like, what's next, I think, you know, in terms of this project, it's kind of a portrait of the relationship between a Chinese nail technician and her Black client. And in initial pitching, a lot of folks were like, so what's the tension? Like, what's the conflict within these communities? What's the issue? It's like about women of color. Like, what's the plot point? And it's been really interesting to have space created for diverse voices and diverse bodies, but I think the next step in my mind is also creating space for us to be nuanced and tell different types of stories that aren't necessarily hinged on our like oppression or suffering. Like I just wanted to make a really beautiful film about how we're seen, and I felt like, okay, I need to like justify why this film should take up space. And a lot of the reason why it's able to be here is because there were folks in the room that were listening to, willing to take the risk of like, not familiar with that space. I don't know what that looks like, but I trust that you know your world and community well enough to tell this story well. So I think that's another important point in terms of like access and resources too.
That's come up across a number of conversations, is that notion that we're on this precipice of, okay, now we've told the transgender story. Okay, we've done that. Now let's move on. Okay, we've told the, disabled story. Like, let's move on. And that there really is more than one story and more than one perspective for any given community. And so how do we like allow for that nuance of story? And I think another important topic is around mentorship. I know, Crystal, you participated in Sundance Ignite, and Eileen, you're really active with a new organization. Do you want to talk about? Yeah, both of you. Great.
Yeah, we both are. Do you want to talk about it? Okay. So just recently this past year, we documentary editors in Los Angeles and now expanded to New York started an alliance called the Alliance of Documentary Editors. AID, yes. And we are sort of just announcing ourselves at this year's Sundance. We have an event coming up. And one of our biggest missions is mentorship, because we realized when we started to organize and we did some surveys about wage and diversity, we realized that there is a huge diversity fall-off between assistant editors and editors. And that the old concept of mentorship doesn't exist anymore. Schedules are tight. There's no time to sit down with your assistant editor and help them, or give them feedback on, let them cut, they're only doing tech stuff. So, one of the biggest missions for this group is to do mentorship and make time for it. And we've already started it. I've had one emerging editor come and just sit with me for a day, sit behind me. And it's something that I got to do as an assistant editor when I was coming up. I was lucky to be able to do that. And so I want to now give back to that. And it's such an amazing experience to watch someone else work. Like, there's nothing like it. You can just take away so many things from that one day or 2 hours of watching someone work. So yeah, everybody check that out. And
Adobe's really proud to be partnering with the ADE. And right. We also actually, for the first time ever, partnering with the Sundance Institute in the Editing Mentor Award here at the festival for both one documentary and one narrative editor, which those will be announced at the Editors Luncheon on Tuesday. So we are going to open it up to questions from the audience here in the space as well as on the live stream. So if you have questions from the live stream, put them in the chat pod. We do have one that I'll kick it off. Let's see. Okay, so from Jeffrey Thomas on Facebook, how does one go about getting your script or vision heard and considered for Sundance? Oh, $1 million question. How about considered? I think actually a big topic that's come up, and Yance, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is sort of, there's about having your story, having a story that you want to tell, but there's also the part of like getting people to buy in and really getting people to back you, and the allyship thing is something that I'm sure comes into play in that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that one of the most important things is to really land on like how you talk about your film in a way that you feel is a reflection of what you want that project to be. And sometimes over the course of making a film that will change. And, obviously how you talk about your film will change as well. But, the sort of the first money into Strong Island was Chicken and Egg Pictures, followed almost immediately by Sundance, and then followed by a lot of other people. And I think that the thing that for me, I didn't have, I sent Strong Island off to the festival with like a kiss and a prayer. And I remember when I got the call, just like everybody else remembers when they get the call, it was a very emotional moment. But for the folks who, I had a relationship with the Institute that started in 2009 at the Creative Producing Lab. And that's when I started figuring out how important it is to really learn how to talk about your film and to, sort of set down your nerves and to remember that you're talking to people who want to say yes. And so figuring out how to make it easy for people to say yes was a huge learning curve. But it's part of it is, making sure that you understand how to talk about audience, how to talk about impact, how to talk about your intention, story, narrative, all of those things that, that storytellers think about when we're just sitting and writing and coming up with how we think we're going to make the film, and then we wind up making it differently because things change when you actually go into production, and then they change again when you go into post. But I also think it's part of it is like having some people who can be a sounding board. I think it's really important not to let yourself get too isolated because, when you have people giving you feedback, you're made stronger by that feedback.
Are there any questions here in the room? Yeah, do we have there's a mic right here coming. Another reminder, if you're in the live stream and want to ask a question, now's your chance.
Hi, this question's for Crystal. That original footage from the People's Video Theater or whatever. I'm sorry. What was your name? Eileen. Okay.
Yes.
Where was that all these years? Was that sitting on a shelf somewhere in a closet, or how did the filmmakers say, hey, let's use this as the basis of the movie?
Yes, it was sitting in someone's closet. So the People's Video Theater, the two guys who showed up at the camp and shot it, they still had the footage. And the way that
was it used for anything else between then and now?
When they first shot the footage, there's a crabs epidemic that happens at the camp. And the People's Video Theater thought that was funny and edited it into like an 8-minute piece, but that never showed it anywhere. I don't know what they did with it, but they just kind of put it away. Community Access TV. Okay, there you go. Yeah. Okay, great. Yes, so that was the only thing that was ever done with the material, but the director, co-director, Jim Lebrecht, was at the camp and shot some of the footage and remembered having done that and had such an amazing time at the camp. He was like, hey, Nicole, let's go find this footage. Like, it's, I remember this. I want to find it. And they called them up and they were like, yep, we still have it. And they were literally right about to start digitizing the footage for their own archive, I think. Yes, yeah.
Any other questions here in the room? Wow, really? Oh, here in the front. Oh, yeah, go ahead. You'll be next.
Telling your own story can be really terrifying, obviously. So what can you say to someone who knows that they have a story to tell, but they're just terrified?
Yeah, you're just going to be terrified. There's just no two ways about it. Telling a story, if you are implied in it in any way, if you are a character in your own story, if you are adjacent to the subject matter, if it happened to you, and even if you're not in the material, the fear is never going to go away. The thing that will actually benefit you as a filmmaker is to learn how to learn from that fear, and learn how to put what you learn from the fear into the work. Because otherwise fear can be paralyzing, but I think fear can also be a really great motivator and a really great tool. But expecting yourself to never be afraid, you should just forget that now, and just accept that you're human and that you're allowed to be afraid. Fear is a very human emotion, and I think that, this sort of fearless documentary filmmaker, trope that is not so prevalent as it was when I first came into the industry it's kind of boring. I'm much more interested in filmmakers who, are human behind the camera, and I think you should allow yourself to be human too.
And I think the fear part manifests itself across every discipline. I mean, I'm sure as editors, like the first time you're going to show your first cut to a new director, and what is that, Can any of the rest of you speak to sort of the fear part of it? Because I think it's a big one, especially if you're coming from an underrepresented community, to really believe that it's not just going to get dismissed.
I mean, I think the fear is good because, I'm terrified every job, always. I think I have a moment on every job I've ever worked. I think every time I've been had that moment, oh, I'm gonna get fired. I'm just gonna get fired. Because you just you have that moment where you're just oh, I think it's that moment where you realize okay, there's a challenge here, and this is important, and I better get it right, And I think that's when the terror comes for me, where I'm oh shoot, this is really important. And I think with Disclosure and previous to that with Hillbilly, it's these are really important films that have not been made, and we're making it, and we better get it right. And so I guess you just have to like what you said, you just have to say, okay, I'm terrified, but if I don't do it, who will? We better just do it and just use that energy to work really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think, the interview process for me, and it's, in terms of being a filmmaker in front of the camera, but I also find that setting up an interview just kind of feels like I don't know, sounds so corny, but a first date. And you have to maximize the amount of time prior to the interview and then during the interview to build the trust necessary to get to where you need to get to. And Deacon Joyner, who you saw in the clip before, was the most phenomenal interview experience I've ever had, because I feel there's a certain level of stress and anxiety that pushes you into the place to ask the necessary questions. And I think we just had met at a time where he was ready to answer those questions and release that. And then the work, I think, in the edit is handling that gift with care. And so a level of fear is not wanting to mess it up, and really taking the time to ensure that what you felt there is interpreted in your work. So yeah, the fearless, I have it all together, can do whatever, my sleep doc thing is such nonsense.
That's actually when you're in trouble, because I think in my experiences is that when everyone's oh, we got this, and that's always the moment when somebody asks that great question of can we go deeper? Why it's a little too easy in this moment. Maybe we're not pushing it enough. And then at the same time, I think if something's too hard, it's probably because you're trying to force it. And so a lot of times when something is just not working, it's not working. It's maybe we're just trying to force something. Maybe we have to just stop for a minute and ask ourselves, does it really belong?
And I feel that goes all the way through to test screenings. You've finished, and now it's oh, let's just send it off and let's not get anybody to feedback, because what if they hate it? You kind of have to keep confronting that fear all the way through.
Yeah, every time. I've worked on films where we didn't do a lot of test screenings, and it's always a big mistake. You have to confront that fear, and it's absolutely terrifying. The first time you show it to a group of people, or the fourth time you show it to a group of people. Every time it's...
So we have a question.
We're all scared.
From the live stream, from Greg Green. He says, can you talk more about the programs out there that allow individuals to begin working in film? And I think this is actually sort of related, but also a different question. How do you take a story and build that to become a film? So I think there's the programs that are out there, but also sort of taking that impetus of a story and making it into something.
I feel I was really lucky to be a part of the Ignite program, which when I was working on Edgecombe, when I was in post on that project, having that community of other filmmakers that were also kind of in the emerging space, really in kind of the world of articulating their voice, was really helpful for me. And going back to mentorship, I think in terms of talking about access, like the biggest thing you can do if you have any sort of privilege or resources is like taking the time to be a mentor, because it like can truly transform how someone is able to tell their stories. And then in a lot of ways, I think both of those questions are really, they correlate in terms of once you're in the space where people are saying yes, and we have X thing to give you to make that happen, you know, it just kind of feels like you're kind of looking around, seeing everyone doing their work and getting access to certain things, and you're like, what did I miss? Like, what am I missing? And then once you're in the space, I think it like completely can change the trajectory of where you go and what your career could be.
I would also recommend looking at the Karen Schmier Editing Fellowship. If you're at all interested in editing, they just launched a diversity program. And they have a fellowship for emerging filmmakers. And I was one of the recipients of it, and it completely changed my whole career and the way I make films. It was very mentorship based, and an amazing program.
And for the fiction editing community, the Sally Minky is a similar program, but for fiction editors. And just for anybody who isn't familiar with Sundance Ignite, it's a partnership between Adobe and Sundance that is for young aspiring filmmakers 18 to 25 to go through a fellowship program through mentorship and connecting with other filmmakers and mentorship and more mentorship. And I believe that the application process opens at the beginning of February. So if you're interested, anybody out there in the live stream, anybody here in the audience, make sure to apply.
And there are also like a lot of regional organizations that provide low cost to no cost training in film and editing. So if you're in New York City, like DCTV and Third World Newsreel, a lot of local regional film festivals.
Well.
Exactly,
I took
Brick.
like a quick premiere refresher at Brick for like no money and started freelancing after that. So like, it's really helpful.
Yeah, I actually really appreciated that on our call. Yance, at the end of our call, he was like, I'd be remiss not to ask you about what Adobe tools do you have that are sort of, accessible for a young person who doesn't know much and can get started. I was like, I'm so glad you asked, Yance. Adobe Premiere Rush, we just recently released it last year. So it really is like, find out what the tools are out there, learn them. Just start doing it. You have a 4K camera in your phone. Just do it. I promised this lady that we would ask her one more question. You're the last question.
My question is your opinion with distribution. Because I'm seeing people now be very picky. They know they have great content. They have a great product. So they're sitting back, because we know content is wanted out there. How involved, or are there times where you go, I know it's gonna be released and out there, but maybe the platform isn't what I really wanted. Where do you think we're going with distribution?
Are we the best people to answer that question? I'm not sure.
It's a big question.
Well, I mean, I would say that I feel really blessed to be making work now. I feel like the resources for emerging filmmakers, but just filmmakers in general, for where to get your work seen is really expanding. Questionable if it's a bubble, we'll see. But there's, I think having options is something that people that mentored me were like, they did the work to ensure that I have the options to be able to say, thank you for offering me that X deal, but I believe in my work enough to do it in the way that I want to do it. The ability to say no, honestly, is something that I feel like a lot of folks worked really hard for me to be able to have that right as well. But I don't know, who knows? I feel like everything's expanding and moving really quickly, but I think especially in the nonfiction space, having options is something that's really exciting.
Absolutely.
And it's really like, there's so much content being made, and there are good things and bad things about that, but I would say, like, as a creator, like, it's great. I mean, there's so many more options now, so many more jobs now than there were 10 years ago, and that's kind of creating, like, this sort of golden age of at least documentaries, it seems like. And then there's all these new streaming platforms that are just now starting. And so when those start to compete with Netflix, like who knows what will happen, but I think it's exciting.
I think that when filmmakers are making their work, if there's anybody a live streamer in the room, don't think about distribution when you're making your work. Like I think the most important thing when you're making your work is to make the work, because we know the distributors are here or there and everywhere waiting to see, what we make. But I think that you have to, there's a certain time in the creative process that is just head down creative time, and hopefully you get to a point where you can have a team that will help you navigate the sales space. But when you're making your film, make your film. That's actually the way I would answer that question, is to make the film first and then, bring on a team that you trust to help you navigate distribution, because there's so much to be navigated.
Good answer. Thank you so much, everyone here in the room, for attending, and thank you to everyone on the live stream for being with us. Be sure to stay tuned to more from Adobe here at Sundance, both on the social channels as well as here at the festival. Thanks so much.